Awesome, Jackson. Happy to have you. So, I'd love to start off at how do you understand where we are in politics in the West now through the lens of history?
Wow, that's a heavy question to start with. I was interviewing someone the other day, or I think I was speaking to them, and they said no, I was
Mm,
interviewing Ian Dale, and he said history repeats or history rhymes, and it's a very good point. I don't think I used to believe history is cyclical. I don't quite think it is now. I think there's a lot
mm,
of events from history that seem to repeat. They rhyme with something in the past, and I think today we're seeing certain events and certain attitudes that are very similar to things in the past. And I think politics in a very polarized position. And when you look, I'm trying to be very diplomatic here. And when you
and you
look,
don't have to be,
yeah,
just to let you know.
when you look at when you look at history, and we've had these polarized points in history, we always end up getting to a very difficult spot
Mm,
where we have to kind of put our differences aside and try and work towards something
mm,
for the greater good for everybody else, or you end up with conflict, and you end up with quite dangerous or bloody conflict, which can have an impact on not just the generation that is present within that conflict, but many generations afterwards. After World War One, politically, whilst we had a period of collaboration through the League of Nations, that very quickly fell apart due to poor structures of reinforcement, poor structures of working together, and we ended up with a very polarized political spectrum across most of Europe, particularly in Germany and Russia, and that led to conflict. And we see a polarized political spectrum in the US. I think the UK is more polarized than I've ever seen it, and you're seeing that across Europe as well. So I I'm very I want to be optimistic about things going forward, but I understand polarization is probably not the best position for us to be in right now.
how do you think we got here? I would say, similar to the UK, the US is extremely polarized right now as well.
Yeah, I think we've had series of crises
Mm,
for God 20 plus years. You had the financial crisis in the mid 2000s. You've had natural disasters. We've had political crisis, particularly here in the UK, and then you have media outlets that allow different views that are very divisive and very dangerous to kind of come to the fray and gain airtime when traditionally we wouldn't have wanted and we wouldn't have allowed those kind of views to get aired.
mm,
And people have come to power, people have become very popular who have stoked the flames of division. You end up with people like Trump who who are aware of that division and seek to stoke it for their own gain and their own political gain. I don't think he believes in everything that he says, but he obviously knows that there's a benefit for him coming across and saying these divisive issues. And likewise, politicians in the UK, when they've witnessed, we had Suella Braverman saying quite a dangerous speech really about immigration that again stokes the flames of division to try and reach a base to support her position, and to try and improve that group's chances of re-election.
mm.
So yeah, you're seeing people feel isolated, marginalized, and then voices and groups try and jump on that to increase their position, but to do so, they have to stoke those flames even further.
Yeah, it sounds like they weren't the ones who lit the flames, but they recognized that the kindling was there, and then they added fuel to the fire to stoke their interests, kind of like as you mentioned. One of the things you said earlier, Jackson, was a popular saying or phrase amongst historians and in history is that history is cyclical, or history rhymes. And you mentioned that is something you don't necessarily agree with. Why is that?
I think it's the cyclical part that I don't necessarily agree with. I don't think history ever repeats itself in
Mm,
exactly the same way, but it rhymes. You have similar events that look very similar to previous events, but there's slight differences. Maybe the outcomes are slightly different, and maybe the pre-existing conditions going towards them are slightly different. And I think jumping into that kind of cyclical thing, it kind of says to us that it will happen again regardless. I think the rhyming bit means that there's always a different path and there's a different route, but things might repeat or might be similar to things that happened in the past. The 2008 financial crisis, that probably rhymed a little bit with the Wall Street crash in the 1920s.
mm.
Similar conditions, but it wasn't exactly the same scenario or situation.
Yeah, beautifully said. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier was how people can recognize that there's a flame, they kindle it, and then for their own gain. So in the lens of history, what usually happens after that?
Yeah, I think what happens after these events is you can have a whole plethora of things.
Mm,
One of my research specialisms is totalitarianism and totalitarian regimes.
mm,
If you start to notice patterns of persecution against certain groups, you
mm,
can start to see, if a group being marginalized and being othered, then you can make predictions of, well, maybe there's going to be this step of a physical state sponsored violence against that group. And then
mm,
if that starts happening, it could possibly lead to a genocide or a democide or a politicide. And then that could possibly lead to a regime becoming totalitarian or authoritarian, whichever term that you prefer. But there's definitely hallmarks within certain actions, certain political decisions, which you can see could possibly lead to a regime becoming a certain type of regime, or can lead to a certain event becoming something else. So it's like those butterfly effects, really, where one thing can lead to another, but it could lead to a whole limitless possibilities of outcomes.
yeah, I think the butterfly effect is a great way to put it. It's this changing of one little thing. We have no idea, kind of the ripple effects that could happen, within society from that. And so when you think about your study of authoritarianism, what lessons do you think we can learn from that time to apply till today?
I well, there's these regimes are so incredibly dangerous, not just for the people living in them, but they're very, very dangerous for the rest of the world as well. And
Mm,
I think the lessons that we can take from the 20th century with Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany, Stalin's regime in the USSR, and Mao's regime in China is that we need to be aware that there are strong leaders in the world
mm,
whose main ambition is to increase their own power, to increase the scope of their power and the totality of their power, and that has implications for minority groups within their countries. And the lesson that I see from this is that we need to engage with these regimes, and we need to work with these regimes and people within the countries to try and prevent these things from happening. Because
mm,
if you allow these regimes to become closed off, and you allow these regimes to continue acting in the way that they want to act, you can possibly see the loss of thousands, if not millions, of people, and we want to avoid that, obviously, in any way that we can, because you know if you allow these regimes to do it, it could possibly spread. As we're seeing with Putin in Russia, it can spread and spill out of those borders into other nations, as China's doing in Tibet. They're having border skirmishes with India, and what they're doing towards the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. You need to engage with these regimes to try and prevent these things from happening.
So this diplomatic approach of, trying to help both sides understand that this is for the common good for everyone. It's not one side pursuing their own self-interest. And what fascinates you so much about political and military strategy to make those kind of areas that you specialize in?
I think I worked my way towards political and military history. So
Mm.
I started off looking at, within my studies at school, I came across social history, and I hated social history. I found it so boring, and I just thought, I don't really care what someone ate for dinner on this day. I don't really care what clothes they wore. It's
Yeah.
not it's not for me. But I
Oh,
found,
fascinating.
oh yeah, it's really not, and I found such interest in wanting to know about the political actions of the day. Why was the United Kingdom of England at that point discussing with France to move against Spain, and why was Britain discussing with France and Russia to neutralize Germany? And I moved from there to then looking at different types of regimes. So I came across this conference from 1953 called the 1953 Conference on Totalitarianism, and I was all of a sudden hooked on wanting to learn about these regimes. Why are these regimes the way that they are? Why are they treating their civilians in the way that they're treating them? And what's motivating their actions? And it just grew from there. And then it went to looking at different authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, and looking at how they fell apart, and the battles that happened. So in Yugoslavia, how did the Yugoslavia fall apart, and what different battles or wars were fought within that fallout? And I found it so fascinating. Not only looking at these regimes, but looking at how they collapsed as well.
And so just to clarify, so social history is more so kind of things along the lines of like what people wore and what they ate.
Yeah, it's more about society and the different aspect. Like, so some social historians love to look at the relationships between people within the courts or within the family. They
Mm,
like to look at attitudes towards sex and morality, or various things like that. And
mm.
it never grabbed me. I was never it never made me go, oh god, I want to learn about that even more. I
Yeah.
just sat there in my chair at school and was like, oh god, not this again.
So with what we just talked about, it's funny. It reminds me of two things, and actually, Chris and I spoke about them. So the first one was, a favorite, kind of thinker I really enjoy listening to is Jordan Peterson, and one thing that he says is, we can choose a lot of things in life, but one of the things that we can't are our interests, and those things, kind of grab us, from the universe and beckon us towards them. And so, completely makes sense that social history, wasn't your cup of tea. I think that's only natural. The other thing is, one thing you mentioned was, you know, societies that collapsed. And, currently, I'm sure you've seen there is a meme going around of, how often do men think about the Roman Empire? And Jackson, for you, why do you think men think about the Roman Empire so much?
I think that's a great question. I don't know. I think it's just one of those things that stand out for men, because there was it's such a fascinating regime. There's everything that is a traditional stereotype trope of what men are interested in. There's so much military conquest
Yep.
across the different types of the Roman Empire, Roman Kingdom, Roman Republic, and so on. There's murder. there's death, there's persecution, there's an awful lot of sex in it as well, and I think that draws a lot of men into going, oh god, yeah, bloodlust, there's fighting, and it's I think it's become this stereotypical view of, along with the Greek empires and Sparta, this stereotypical view of masculinity, that men aspire, I dangerously or not, aspire to try and replicate this ancient form of masculinity, which is probably no longer applicable to modern society. I don't know how applicable me dressing in a toga and trying to kill a lion is, but I think it stands out to men for that reason. I've seen the female version as well. How many times a day do you think of Anne Boleyn? So I think there are certain types of history which naturally different types of people are drawn to. I've seen within my demographics and within my listener statistics, my female listenership tend to enjoy my Tudor stuff more. And
Mhm.
my male audience tends to listen to my military history a bit more. I don't think about the Roman Empire that much, actually.
That's fascinating, and I think one thing you touched upon was these, ancient forms or traditions of masculinity that people try to replicate today. And so, how has the concept of masculinity evolved over time?
I think I think it's quite difficult for me. Like, this is part of social history that I don't really touch on. I think
Mm,
it's grown from being, from what I can view from my position, it's grown from being something that is stereotypically, muscle bound, power dominated, and power dominated, and seeking to dominate and rule, to feel
mm,
powerful yourself as well, to something that's a little bit more fluid. I think masculinity is being able to be comfortable and open. You know, no longer do we really need to show our physical strength too much. That's a personal choice. I like I like working out, and I like feeling personally physically strong because I feel more comfortable and confident in myself. But I
mm.
also think being able to talk about your feelings and be open and discuss mental health and stuff, I think that's also a hallmark of a strong person, because it's something that, because it's been shunned for millennia, it's not something that traditionally men do. But I
Mm.
think being able to do that and go past that stigma does show real strength.
I completely agree, and I think you described it along the lines of kind of what I'd like to subscribe to as well. So, for you, what are stories in history that you wish more people knew about, and what lessons can we draw from them?
Wow. I think one person who always stands out for me is,
Mm.
he was a man at this 1953 conference on totalitarianism, which, again, I think more people should know about that conference. I wrote a book on it, and I'm like, oh, people should know about it.
Yeah.
I completely understand people don't care about it. Like, it's a really random conference in the 50s. But there was this man there called Jerzy G. Glicksman, and I am absolutely fascinated by Jerzy. He was a he was a political prisoner in the USSR. He got shipped to various satellite republics and across the USSR on ship on trains and train containers, doing manual labor, forced labor, and he managed to escape. And he wrote a book called Go Tell the West, which is a fascinating book trying to expose how the Soviet Union was treating its political prisoners, how horrible that treatment was. And he then wrote a paper for this conference called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's talking about the prophylactic sense of political terror, how it instills fear not just in the victims but in societies as a
Mm.
whole. And his story of being a political prisoner, being in forced labor camps and so on, and trying to expose that is fascinating. But what I find even more fascinating is that, he goes to this 1953 conference, and I can't find him at all. Um, and we like to look at the big ticket headline stories of political terror. Anne Frank's diary is a really great resource to learning about political terror in Nazi Germany and the persecution of the Jewish people in Germany. But then we have so many other similar works like Jerzy G. Glicksman, which discuss it from different perspectives and give a perspective that we don't look at very often at all. But they're just so forgotten and lost. Like Jerzy G. Glicksman's book isn't in print anymore. I had to read it through the Internet Archive. So,
Mm.
stories like that we've lost or haven't been recorded are those things that I encourage people to go out and find out more about, or go and read. Or, if you're interested in a particular person, you can find them at one point, but you can't find them anywhere else. Go and find them and learn their story, because otherwise we're going to lose that.
Wow. So you brought to life the story of someone that was almost lost to history. Why is that important to you?
I think it was important to me because I wanted to discuss totalitarianism, and I wanted to discuss the impact of these regimes. And when there's someone who is so clearly terrified of this regime, and the impact of this regime and the power of that regime, and to the extent that you can't find anything about him after that conference, I think it's important to highlight that. There were
Mm.
so many speakers at that conference, and a lot of them were refugees from Germany, or they were academics who were living in the US. They were former communists, but he was one of the few who managed to escape the USSR during the height of Stalin's Great Terror in the 30s. And these the reasons why these things are called purges and Great Terrors is because very few people who are victims of them are getting out of them and being able to escape. And when you can hear these
Mm.
stories and you can learn about the brutality of them from a contemporary, from someone who was actually there, it it illuminates it so much more than a secondary source from a historian who's just studied the data in the archives and so on.
Yes, beautifully said. This firsthand account of the reality of what it was like to live during that time, I think is so important because, to your point, so much of history is, second, third hand, fourth hand, and how much can get, diluted, from it. And so I think it's important for people to kind of understand specifics of what that brutality looked like. Was there a story that you heard from him or read that really stuck out to you?
I think one that stuck out to me is that he was going through. I think it was Poland. I think he was going through Poland on this train, and he was in one of the carriages at the back of the train. They were big metal, cattle trailers, and he managed to escape. And it was winter, and there was snow everywhere. It was freezing cold, and he was trying to get to, I think it was phone booths, or to be able to talk to people to try and get his way out, or trying to contact someone who could get him out. And the very the very fact that he was willing to risk his life, because he'd already escaped something that he shouldn't have escaped, the very fact that he was willing to risk his life and risk the life of his family to be able to get out and to have a better life really stuck with me. And you read these stories of people in North Korea during Kim Il Sung and Kim Jong Il's reign, and even today for Kim Jong Un. They
Mm.
commit a political crime. It's not just them that goes into a prison camp or a concentration camp. It is, often it's their whole immediate family, and in some cases, it's their whole family to the seventh degree. And when people are willing to risk their lives to get out of these regimes and to tell the story of these regimes, they're not just risking their life; they're risking, you know, 8 degrees, 7 degrees, 6 degrees of their family and their immediate family. And I think it's really courageous that people like Jerzy G. Glicksman are willing or were willing to tell these stories at such a huge personal cost.
And when you put that risk in the frame of, their possible family that could get affected goes all the way out to the eighth or seventh degree, it just makes it that much more crazy about, how scary it is, like what they were actually doing. Because as a family member, you're like, okay, if I'm just risking my own life, I can swallow that. But if I'm risking the lives of everyone else, is that something I can accept? And that's something that really rings true for me. My parents and my family escaped the Vietnam War, and I remember hearing stories of my uncle talking about how there were two paths laid in front of him and his brothers when they were running away from the communist soldiers. It was the soldiers chasing them from behind, or it was an alligator infested lake in front of them, and they had to swim across. And I think about how crazy that is for me to think about as someone who grew up in the US, with all of the privileges that I could have asked for. And it almost doesn't seem real sometimes. And so I think it's, so beautiful to bring those stories back up because, it gives people a second to pause, about the life that, we're all living. So Jackson, we've talked, about, political strategy. And so now I'd love to move into your interest of a military strategy. And, when I think about military strategy as someone who doesn't know anything about it, I think about, the Art of War, by Sun Tzu. And in the self-development world, that's the book everyone says, like, you need to read. And so when it comes to military strategy, what's a story there, or what is something that is a lesson you feel like listeners could learn from?
I think I've learned a lot recently about Clausewitzian theory and genocidal wastage,
Hmm.
and also looking at guerrilla warfare within different military contexts, and something that I've seen throughout these different military stories and the different military histories that I write, which are very narrative in the way that I write them. I've I've always noticed that often the smaller state, the state that has less resources and less power, when their homeland is under threat, their family is under threat, they are often able to kind of dig deep and
Mm.
find something that allows them to kind of overcome the odds. In the Yugoslavian war, the Yugoslav army under the direction of Slobodan Milosevic was an incredibly brutal army that had possible genocidal direction, and they were certainly very very brutal in their actions towards the republics trying to split from Yugoslavia. But the republics that were trying to maintain their independence or gain their independence, not only was it their military and their police force fighting against this big oppressive state, the civilians got involved as well. So in Croatia, the civilians, they made their own roadblocks. They sacrificed their own cars or their own goods to try and slow this big oppressive army down. Some of them even tried to fight in these small skirmishes against them. And I think when you look at that, I'm so lucky that I've never had to be in a situation like that, and I've never had to go to war or hold a gun in anger. But I always find something remarkable in the fact that these people, their homeland, their home, their families are under attack. And like we were just saying about these people emerging from totalitarian regimes or authoritarian regimes, and like your family story coming from Vietnam, they are willing to risk everything to safeguard the future of not only their children but their children's children. And I think some like a lesson from that I've seen is sometimes you got to sacrifice something. Sometimes you've really got to dig deep and put yourself through a difficult point to be able to ensure that there's a better future there for someone.
Oof. Okay. That you're touching on, I got goosebumps because, one thing you mentioned is you noticed people had the ability to tap into something, when their home countries were getting attacked, even if they were less funded, less, more poorly equipped, had less of manpower. What do you think those people were tapping into?
I think because I've never sorry, that's my chair. Because I've never been in that situation myself. You know, I can't say what they're tapping into.
Hmm.
And I don't think any of us could really put a finger on what they're tapping into. I mean, the closest I've ever really been to conflict is playing rugby, and even within that 80 minutes that you're playing, you live and die by the 14 men that are on the pitch with you,
Hmm.
and you for those 40 minutes a half, you sit there and you look after the guy next to you, and you look after the guy two places down the line from you, because that's your job, and it's just very much a freight, like a switch just hits, and you've just got to get on with it. So that, I mean, that's the closest I've ever come to conflict. So I can't possibly say what they're digging into, but in that sporting context, it's the closest I can make to it. You do just, there is a switch that flicks, and it's something that you have to do.
It's beautiful because your rugby example, I think what it taps into is the team is put in the best position for success when everyone is in service to the man next to them. And it's beautiful because I have found this theme of how important it is to be in service to others throughout so many industries. So I'll give you some examples. Do you know who Jocko Willink is? He's a popular Navy SEAL. Okay, so he's a
No.
popular Navy SEAL. You would love him. He led one of the most like decorated units in Navy SEAL history. And one thing he talked about was, for all of the dangerous missions that they embarked on, one of the core tenets is the best chance for this mission to succeed is not to look out for your own life, but look out for the life of the guy next to you, and then they'll do the same for you. And that's like military here, and so there's that theme. But it's crazy. I actually interviewed an actor, not the episode that you watched, but another one, and she mentioned to create kind of the best scene possible, you have to think about how you can be in service of your scene partner so that you can have the audience understand everything that they're doing and worry less about yourself. And I think it's so beautiful, because it's this concept that I feel like is a fundamental truth, across, history and society. And so when you think about this theme of being in service to others, does any examples in history stand out to you?
I think, wow, I think there's, those people who risked their life during the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews.
Mm.
That there was such enormous personal personal cost at that. People were hiding Jewish people in their houses. People were paying and organizing for Jewish people who were under persecution to leave Germany, and the risk for them was death. The risk for their family was death. And I find all those, I can't pick one individual story off the top of my head. Obviously we all have that that one view of Oscar Schindler's List, and there was that one case, I think, on a television chat show in the 80s in the US, where that man saved so many of those children. They were all in the audience. Those little moments where you can just, it's a moment of resistance where they quite clearly don't agree with what's happening in that country, and they're willing to risk everything to make sure that at least someone or another family has an opportunity to be treated with the respect that they deserve.
Yes. And I actually had a conversation with a friend the other day about a topic similar to this, which is in that moment, everyone would love to say that they would be able to make the right decision, but we'll never know because we've never been put into it. And to think that we know with full conviction that we'd be able to do that, put in that situation, I think is a bit overly optimistic. So that's what it reminded me of when you spoke about it. When it comes to military strategy, I think especially as guys, a lot of times, I think about my experience playing Call of Duty in Xbox. And so has there been any instances where one side really outsmarted the other with military strategy? And I'm sure there has been, but I'm curious what stands out to you.
Wow. Well, I think there's been a lot of conflict where that's really like there's been so many cases of people being outsmarted, um, overpowered, or being fighting against the odds. But one example that really sticks out to me is I started out as a medievalist before moving into modern political history and modern politics.
Something for you and Chris to bond about.
Yeah, oh, yeah, 100% it is. We've definitely talked about this for hours on end. But in 1470 something, I can't remember, but it's during the Wars of the Roses in England. Edward the Fourth had been kicked off the throne by by the guy who made him king, the Earl of Warwick, and the Earl of Warwick had done the re-adeption of Henry VI. So Henry VI was put back on the throne, and Edward the Fourth decided to come back and take back his throne, and he met the Earl of Warwick at the Battle of Barnet. I think it is the Battle of Barnet. Now, the Earl of Warwick was Edward's mentor. He was the guy who taught him basically all his military strategy and knowledge, who guided him through the Wars of the Roses, who guided him through his consolidation of power.
Mm,
Everything that Edward knew about military and military strategy and generalship and leadership, mainly he'd gotten from the Earl of Warwick, Richard the Earl of Warwick. And at this battle, Edward just, he really came into his own as a military leader, a military general. And it's just like he instinctively knew what the Earl of Warwick was going to do at this battle. And everything was just perfectly countered. And
mm,
Edward took quite a strong victory. Warwick was killed at the battle. But as someone who started off loving the Wars of the Roses, being a medievalist, that battle always stands out for me because it shows that you know that someone overcoming the odds and really coming into their own against someone who had basically controlled their life for the past 10 years and taught them everything that they know.
One theme that I'm pulling out that we've spoken a lot about are these stories that really embody the human spirit, where people overcome everything, even though all of the odds are against them. I think that is a theme that, from my perspective, people will love until the end of time.
Yeah, no,
Who are people?
I
Oh, go ahead.
totally agree with that, but I think one thing to remember about a lot of that is that a lot of the history is written by the people who win the battles and the people who have won it. It's a great
Mm,
piece of propaganda, but certainly medieval propaganda,
mm,
when you can argue, you know, I came from this, I came from nothing, and I overcame the odds, and I am the rightful king, or I am the rightful winner of these battles.
mhm.
So whilst these stories are always good, medieval chroniclers are also very good at telling stories. So you know, I do take a lot of them with a pinch of salt because I know that they're there to illustrate a story and then to talk up these victors because if they didn't talk up the victors, there was also a cost to them as well. So it's they're great stories, but sometimes they are very embellished.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm glad you brought that up because when I think about, chronicling history and, finding a fine balance between, reporting what happened with, if I make this too dry, then is anyone, going to read it or consume it? And so there needs to be a little bit of storytelling in it. And how do we kind of balance those two things?
I think it's something that I'm trying to do in my writing as well, because I recognise that no one's going to read it if it's boring, dry, and academic. Um, I don't want to read things that are boring, dry, and academic, and I'm trying to be in academia. But I think the one way of doing that is, creative writing. I've always found is a great tool of actually trying to describe vividly what happened in those moments.
Mm.
Trying to envision and place yourself in that moment. What does it sound like? What does it smell like? What is it? What are you feeling physically in those moments? And then try and add those facts into it. So in my writing process, when I try and do these, I I very plainly, firstly, like matter of factly, add all the facts into my plan of like, okay, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. Okay, what would someone in that moment feel? What are they seeing, hearing, smelling? And then I add all of those kind of things in. Some of the great writers, as much as I hate him when I get to an end of story, Charles Dickens is incredibly good at describing what his main character is seeing, feeling, hearing, smelling, and all that. And
Mm.
I like to try and find those things. And if you can add those things and describe those scenes and then add the facts and bring a narrative into it, I think it makes it far more exciting than trying to embellish it. Some of these medieval
Oh,
chroniclers, or some of these medieval
fascinating.
chroniclers used to go, "Oh, he was sick. He was so tall and handsome, and he was strong and big, and he had great eyes. And then you find the skeleton, and you're like, well, he had a massive overbite. He was shorter than you thought he was, and he had X, Y, and Z. And you're like, well, you're embellishing it because it makes you look good, and you're trying to ingratiate yourself with that leader. So there's a fine line. I think medieval chroniclers probably cross that line sometimes. But I think when we chronicle today, it's very different because I think we're aware now that we're writing not just for the audience of today, we're writing for the audience tomorrow as well.
Wow, we're not just writing for today, but we're writing for the audience of tomorrow too. Oh, beautifully said. Jackson, in history, who do you look up to?
Well, I think I'm very conscious of trying to try and do things my own way and create my own path. But if I was to look up to anyone, I look up to my family. My family have tried to give me everything I ever could have asked for, and they support me, regardless of what I'm doing. But they're always there to give me, honest opinion, honest feedback. They've my mum and dad have raised me and my three brothers. Through we've had hard times, but they're still together. They still love each other. Me and my three brothers have all grown up, and we're all really close. So I look up to my brothers and my family, my mum, dad, my grandparents, because they've forged a path and they've looked after us all, and been able to be happy, and have always told us to be happy. I look up to them because they're the reason why I do what I do, and I'm able to do what I do.
Beautiful answer. How do you plan to give back to them for everything they've done for you?
I try and make them proud with what I do, and I try and be there for them. I definitely am going to try and look after them as well as I can when they're growing old, and just be there for them when they need me. I want to give my mum and dad everything in the world, because they truly deserve it. Yeah, I don't know how I'm going to pay them back, but yeah, I think they deserve everything that they can possibly have, and I want to try and do that for them.
This might fall a little bit under, political history, maybe one foot in, one foot out. Currently, there is a theme in the US that the nuclear family is under attack, and that the nuclear family is one of the most important things for the success of the children in a family. What have you learned about nuclear family kind of in your studies? And I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
I think I think family is what you make it.
Hmm.
I think people who are saying that the nuclear family is under attack, I think it's a bit of a narrative that's been created just to try and to rally against certain things that they think are agendas and being pushed on children. If you are in a loving and supportive environment, regardless of the fact if that's, you have parents who are part of the LGBT community, you're in a single family, like a single parent family, it does. I don't think it matters what that family unit is, as long as a child has the support and love that they need. I'm a teacher, and I've seen and taught kids who don't have the love and care that they need, and some of them get it from elsewhere, and some of them sadly don't. I have friends who I've known for 20 years, 15 years, and I consider them family because they've always been there for me, and I've always been there for them when they've needed it. So I think family is what you make it, and family is who you consider family. Sometimes I don't think the phrase "blood is thicker than water" is necessarily applicable for some people. I'll do everything for my family, but I have friends who are close, and I consider family as well. So I think that nuclear family discourse, or people claiming it's under attack, are trying to feel threatened by something that they don't understand, and
Mm.
they're trying to create a narrative to try and protect something which is not under attack. Because at the end of the day, it's all about what the child needs, and what's
Mm.
best for the child.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, one thing you touched on that's interesting is, recognizing, currents in society and like, okay, what is the undercurrent to that? And, is this coming from a place that's justified? One thing you mentioned is your role as a teacher. How do you prioritize what parts of history that you teach? Because I'm sure you would love to teach everything under the sun, but you have to pick and choose.
Unfortunately, because I'm in the UK, I don't actually have a lot of choice.
Mm.
We have a national curriculum that we have to follow,
Mm.
and we have to make sure certain things are taught. So we have to make sure change and continuity within certain periods is taught, and we teach British history, or mainly English history, throughout that. So from just prior to 1066, just before the Battle of Hastings, we have to cover, and we usually end up finishing with the Industrial Revolution. We have to teach change and continuity and the role of church and so on within that period. How, which subjects you tackle within there is kind of your prerogative on what you really focus on within your school department. But from what I've seen, a lot of schools tend to focus on the same things. You end up with the Peasants' Revolt, you end up with maybe the Hundred Years' War or the Wars of the Roses. 100% you end up focusing on the Tudors, and then a little bit of the Georgians, and then the Industrial Revolution. But yeah, and then you get your GCSEs and different GCSE, but you get a little bit more flexibility about that. Different GCSE boards have different subjects, but then again, you have to choose the GCSE board which is better for your students, and then you have to choose the subjects which are better for them, and then you still have to teach the content for them to pass
Mm.
the exam. So there's a little less choice in it, but the way that you approach it and the way that you tell it
Mm.
is the big part of that. So I like to help students discover it for themselves. Here's the information, here's how we here's the skills. What do you think? Because if I end up standing there, at the whiteboard with my pen, in my suit and tie, saying, this is what happened, this is how it happened, this is why it happened, this is what you got to say. there's no there's no chance of these kids developing their own independent thought and their own opinions on these historical events.
Mm.
And if I hand them the skills and the tools to do that, that skill is transferable to other subjects and into life. I don't think King John is that bad a king, but I taught kids, and at the end of that lesson, some kids were like, "I hate King John. He's an awful man. I think he's the worst king in British history." And I'm like, oh, I don't think he's that bad. So, the fact that I've given them those skills to make those decisions and get those opinions is what I think is important in the teaching of history.
Kids are something I have a huge passion around. I spent a year teaching junior high school kids. So I think junior high school for us is 11 to 14 around there. And if I think about some moments that I hold near and dear to my heart, it's the times where I had a moment with a student where they really lit up about, something they learned, or you could tell that, something was kind of calling or beckoning them. Are there any moments with students that stand out to you?
Yeah, so I had some students who didn't like history when they joined my class, and then at the end of the year they'd found a subject that really they were really enthusiastic about, they wanted to learn more about. But mainly with the kids, I it was the moments that stood out to me were the funny personal connections, where, you know, some of these kids are absolutely hilarious and they don't realize that they're hilarious. So I had some students who I had to send them out because it was totally inappropriate. But, just saying, "Oh, sir, you're massive. Who's going to win in a fight between you and this teacher?" I'm like, oh, like, you shouldn't be saying this. Out. I'll talk to you in 2 minutes. And, it's those moments where, as a student, I would have 100% wet myself laughing at what he was saying to me. But as a teacher, I had to maintain that level of
Of course.
professional persona. But inside, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty funny, but you can't be telling me I'm fit and you can't be telling I'm massive because that's crossed the line. And we're talking about Titanic. So it's those moments that stand out to me.
You brought back a rush of memories, from my time teaching as well. And so, Jackson, as we wrap up, I'd love to ask you, what are lessons in history that you wish, everyone knew?
Wow. I think I wish that everyone is aware of the dangers. We've touched on it today in this episode. Everyone's aware of the dangers of totalitarian, authoritarian, and autocratic regimes, and everyone is more aware of being able to say something against these regimes. Um, I'm always very passionate about calling out the Chinese actions against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. It's absolutely horrific. It's akin to a genocide, and it's possibly getting to that point. And I think that's the main lesson that I like to make sure people come away with is that you can say something, you should say something, and the more the West kind of as that collective point say something and stand up against this, the more likely it is to be heard.
And the incredible opportunity is if you live in a country where you can speak up about those things without, fear of retribution, then you only have that responsibility even more.
Oh, 100%. We are incredibly lucky to be in a country where we have countries that we have freedom of speech, and we need to make sure we use that for good. But also, I think people need to remember that just because we have freedom of speech doesn't mean we have freedom from consequence. And whilst these are the autocratic totalitarian regimes, they have, you don't have freedom of speech, and these people living in these countries aren't able to exercise that. We should exercise ours, but exercise it with a level of maturity and responsibility, and not come out with stupid and dangerous rhetoric that can be equally as dangerous as not saying anything.
Yes, it definitely comes with the responsibility to be discerning with whatever you say. And so, last question, Jackson, because I'm glad you brought it up. Why is freedom of speech important?
I think it's important for us to be able to talk about our opinions, talk about our opinions of what the powers above are saying, and how we want things to be done. Because people in these regimes, they haven't got the power to, in Stalin's regime, if you criticize Stalin, you often left with your life. You weren't left with your life. So I think it's important for us to be able to exercise that opinion that other people aren't able to and haven't been able to through history, because it is an incredible privilege that we're able to do it and do it so freely.
Well, with that being said, Jackson, thank you so much for coming on the Creators Canvas. I really enjoyed the conversation.
No, thank you very much for having me.